They say a mother's heart isn't born, it's chosen. But sometimes that choice is made for you, in the dead of night, by a ghost you've never even met. This is the story of Evelyn May Porter, and you need to listen closely because every single thing you think you know about her is about to change. It started with a promise, a new life, a new beginning, a husband waiting for her across the dusty plains. At 38, the world had told Evelyn she was too old, too plain, too much of a wallflower to ever find a home of her own. But a man named Caleb Avery had seen her picture, read her letters, and sent for her. He'd promised her a roof over her head and a family to call her own. So she boarded that stagecoach. She traveled for weeks, her entire life packed into a single worn trunk, her mother's last dress folded neatly on top. She clutched the letter from Caleb, the paper worn soft from 100 readings. He wrote of sunsets over the prairie, of a sturdy cabin built with his own two hands, of a quiet life waiting just for her. When the wagon finally creaked to a halt, this is what she saw. A cabin, yes, but one that looked tired. The wood was silvered and splintered. The windows were dark like vacant eyes. And on the porch, not a man with welcoming arms, but 7 silent children. 7 of them. The oldest boy stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of suspicion. He looked no older than 12, but his eyes were ancient. A gaggle of smaller children hid behind him, peeking out like frightened deer. And at the very front, a tiny girl with tangled blonde hair clutched a doll with a missing eye. They just stared. The only sound was the wind, whistling a lonely tune through the tall grass. This wasn't right. This wasn't the picture Caleb had painted. "Hello." Evelyn's voice was a dry whisper. I'm looking for Mr. Caleb Avery." The oldest boy just squinted at her. He didn't answer. He just jerked his head toward the cabin door, which was hanging slightly ajar. Evelyn's heart started to pound, a frantic drum against her ribs. She took a step forward, then another, her boots sinking into the dry, unforgiving dirt. Something was terribly wrong. She pushed the door open. The cabin was dark, and it smelled of old wood smoke and something else. Something like sorrow. It was empty, a table with a single chair, a stone hearth, cold and black, and in the corner, a small, crudely made crib. Evelyn walked toward it, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She expected to find it empty, but there was something inside, not a baby, just a single folded piece of paper. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The writing was messy, desperate. It was only 2 words. "Help me." That was it. No husband, no welcome. Just 7 silent children on the porch and a desperate plea from a ghost. Any sane woman would have turned around. She would have marched back to that wagon and told the driver to take her anywhere but here. But then the littlest girl, the one with the one-eyed doll, padded up behind her. Her feet were bare and smudged with dirt. She tugged on Evelyn's dress. "Are you going to leave too?" she whispered. Evelyn looked down at the child's face, at the raw hope in her eyes. And in that moment, something inside Evelyn, something she thought had died long ago, cracked open. It wasn't a choice anymore. It was a calling. She knelt down, her fancy travel dress brushing the dusty floorboards. "No," she said, her voice finding a strength she didn't know it had. "I'm not going anywhere." That night she learned their names. Will, the oldest, the silent guardian. Eli and Maggie, the twins who moved as one. Joe, who whittled small animals out of scraps of wood. Elsie, who was afraid of the dark. And Daisy, the little one who had asked her to stay. There was one more Samuel, who watched everything from the shadows of the loft, never speaking a word. She cooked the last of her food, a handful of hard biscuits and some dried meat, and split it 8 ways. They ate in silence, the only sound the scrape of forks on tin plates. The children watched her every move, their eyes filled with a caution that broke her heart. They were waiting for the other shoe to drop. They were waiting for her to disappear just like everyone else. Later, as she lay on a thin cot near the hearth, she heard Will whisper to Eli from the loft above. She stayed. A pause, then a softer whisper. "For now." The next morning, Evelyn was determined to make this place a home. She needed to know what she was up against. She needed to understand the man who had brought her here only to vanish. She started cleaning, sweeping away the dust and the sadness. She opened cupboards, finding them mostly bare. She checked drawers looking for anything, a clue, a letter, an explanation. In a small drawer beside the cold hearth, tucked beneath a stack of old rags, she found them. A neat little pile of letters, 7 of them, tied together with a piece of twine. They were addressed to Caleb Avery, but they had never been sent. They weren't from him. They were from the children. Her hands shook as she untied the twine. The first letter was from Will, his handwriting surprisingly neat. Pa, Eli's boots have holes again. He says his feet don't hurt, but I saw the blood on the floorboards this morning. We're running low on flour. I shot a rabbit yesterday, so we had meat. We still say grace like Ma taught us. Please come home. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She picked up another. This one from Maggie, the ink smudged with what looked like tear stains. Pa, Daisy asks for you every night. She's starting to forget what your face looks like. I try to tell her stories about you, but I'm forgetting too. Elsie is scared of the storms. She thinks the thunder is monsters coming to get us. Are they? She read every single one. Each letter was a small blade twisting in her heart. They wrote of hunger, of cold, of fear. They wrote of a life lived on the very edge of survival, all while waiting for a father who never came back. But it was the last letter, the one on the bottom, that shattered her completely. It was written in the shaky, uncertain hand of a child just learning his letters. It was from Samuel, the silent boy in the loft. It was just one sentence, one question that no child should ever have to ask. Are we still worth loving if no one comes back? Evelyn pressed the letters to her chest, the sharp edges of the paper digging into her skin. This wasn't just abandonment. This was a crime. A man had left his 7 children to starve, to wonder if they were even worthy of love. All her sorrow curdled into a cold, hard rage. She wanted to find Caleb Avery. She wanted to make him read these letters, to hear the pain in his children's words. But he was gone, and she was here. She carefully placed the letters into an old wooden box, a coffin for a promise he had broken. Then she stood up, wiped her eyes, and walked outside. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. It was a new day. She grabbed the axe leaning against the cabin wall. It was heavy, unwieldy in her hands, but she swung it anyway. The wood split with a satisfying crack. She chopped wood until her arms ached and her palms were raw. She hauled water from the creek. She found a small patch of wild onions behind the cabin and cooked them with cornmeal for breakfast. She was no longer a guest. She was no longer a victim of a cruel trick. She was the only thing standing between these 7 children and the wilderness. Later that day, Will found her by the woodpile. He stood there for a long time just watching her. "You read 'em, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low. Evelyn stopped, leaning on the axe handle. "I did." He kicked at a loose stone. "You mad at him?" "I'm not mad," she said, her voice softer than she expected. "I'm just sorry you had to write them." He didn't say anything else, but a few minutes later, he came back with another axe and started splitting logs right alongside her. It was the first crack in the wall he had built around himself. That night, something shifted in the little cabin. The silence wasn't as heavy. The fear wasn't as sharp. Evelyn told them a story, not a fairy tale, but a story about a woman who thought she was all used up, who thought the world had no place for her. A woman who traveled a long, long way and found 7 reasons to believe she was wrong. As she spoke, Daisy, the littlest one, crawled into her lap. She rested her head against Evelyn's chest and whispered, "You smell like home." Evelyn held her tight, fighting back tears. Maybe, just maybe, this broken place could be mended. Maybe she could be the one to do it. But she was wrong. The real storm hadn't even started yet, and the next morning it arrived on horseback. It had been a week of small victories. Will was talking more. Maggie was smiling. Samuel even came down from the loft to watch her cook, his dark eyes following her every move. For the first time, Evelyn allowed a tiny seed of hope to sprout in her heart. This could work. They could be a family. Then she heard the sound of hoofbeats. It wasn't a frantic gallop, but a slow, deliberate rhythm. A rider was approaching the cabin. Evelyn's first thought was, "Caleb, he's come back." A complicated mix of relief and fury washed over her. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch, bracing herself. The children gathered behind her, their brief moment of peace shattered. But the man who rode into the yard wasn't the man from the faded photograph Caleb had sent her. This man was a stranger. He was tall and weathered, with a hat pulled low over his eyes. He rode a fine chestnut horse, much too fine for a simple homesteader. He dismounted slowly, his movements careful, measured. He took off his hat, revealing a face etched with the lines of a hard life and eyes the color of a stormy sky. He wasn't here by accident. He was looking for her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, "are you Evelyn May Porter?" "I am," she said, her hand instinctively going to Will's shoulder, pulling him closer. The stranger reached into his dusty coat and pulled out a sealed envelope. The paper was yellowed and worn, as if it had traveled a great distance. "I was told to deliver this into your hands, and your hands only." Evelyn took the letter. It felt heavy, far heavier than paper ought to be. Her name was written on the front in a familiar, looping script. It was Caleb's handwriting. She tore it open, her fingers fumbling. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small, pressed wildflower. "My dearest Evelyn, if you are reading this, it means I failed. It means I couldn't make it back home. I want to say I'm sorry, but I know that word isn't big enough for what I've done. I brought you all this way on a lie." Evelyn had to read that line twice. A lie? The truth is, this life was never mine to give. I was running from a man I owed a debt to, a man who doesn't believe in forgiveness. I thought I could build something new out here, something clean, but my past followed me. He found me. He gave me a choice, the land or the children. I couldn't give him my children, Evelyn, so I gave him the land. But I knew he wouldn't stop there. A man like that, he takes everything. So I did the only thing I could think of. I led him away. I'm writing this from a town 100 miles north. I'm going to keep running, keep drawing him further and further from my family. I sent for you because I saw the kindness in your face. I knew you were strong. Those children, they need someone better than me, someone who isn't haunted. Please, Evelyn, don't let them pay for my mistakes. The man who is after me, his name is Thacker. He thinks the homestead is abandoned. He'll come to claim it. Don't let him. Whatever you do, don't let him have it. Thank you for coming, even if I couldn't stay. Yours, Caleb." The world tilted on its axis. Caleb hadn't abandoned his children. He had sacrificed himself for them. He hadn't tricked her. He had chosen her. He had seen something in her, a strength she hadn't seen in herself, and entrusted her with the most precious thing in his life. The rage she had felt dissolved, replaced by a profound, aching sadness. She looked up at the stranger, who was watching her with an unreadable expression. "Thank you for bringing this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. The man nodded. "Caleb was, a friend. He asked me to watch over them, to make sure they were safe until you arrived." A friend? Something about his story didn't sit right. A man sends for a bride, vanishes, and a friend just happens to be watching from the shadows? "You've been here this whole time?" Evelyn asked, her suspicion pricking at the edges of her grief. "Watching us?" "Keeping my distance," the man corrected. "Caleb made me promise not to interfere unless it was a matter of life or death. He wanted you to have a real chance to bond with them, without a stranger looming over you. It made a twisted kind of sense, but it still felt strange, deceptive." "Who are you?" she asked. The man hesitated for a moment, his gaze shifting toward the horizon. "My name is Daniel," he said finally. "Just Daniel. Just Daniel." The name meant nothing to her, but his eyes held a story he wasn't telling. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this man was hiding something. He knew more about Caleb, more about this Thacker, and more about the danger they were in than he was letting on. That night, after the children were asleep, Evelyn sat by the fire, Caleb's letter in her lap. The story was bigger and darker than she had ever imagined. They weren't just orphans, they were fugitives. And their home wasn't just a home, it was a target. She thought about the stranger, Daniel. He said he was a friend, a protector, but his presence felt like a secret, another piece of a puzzle she couldn't solve. Why was he really here? What was his connection to Caleb? She stood up and walked to the small wooden box where she had placed the children's letters. She ran her fingers over the rough wood. Caleb had left this box behind. Maybe he had left something else too. She began to search the cabin again, this time with a new sense of urgency. She ran her hands along the floorboards, tapping, listening for a hollow sound. She checked the loose stones in the hearth. Nothing. Finally, her eyes landed on the heavy wooden mantel above the fireplace. It was thick, solid oak. But as she ran her hand along the underside, her fingers brushed against something that wasn't wood, a small leather tab. She pulled. A section of the mantel slid open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal. Her heart hammered in her chest. This was it, the rest of the story. She opened it to the first page. The entry was dated just 2 days before she was due to arrive. Thacker found me. He knows about the children. He says the land is his, a payment for my debts. But it's not the land he wants. It's the water, the spring that runs beneath the south pasture. It runs clear, even in the worst drought. He wants to own the only reliable water source for 100 miles. He'll bleed this whole territory dry. Evelyn felt a cold dread creep up her spine. This wasn't just about a small homestead. It was about controlling the lifeblood of the entire region. She turned the page. The next entry made her blood run cold. Daniel doesn't trust me. He thinks I'm a coward for running. He doesn't understand. Thacker won't just take the land. He'll erase us. My brother doesn't see the devil behind that man's eyes. He only sees my failure. Brother. Daniel wasn't just a friend. He was Caleb's brother. He had stood in her yard and lied directly to her face. And if he was lying about that, what else was he lying about? Was he here to protect them? Or was he here for something else entirely? Suddenly, the lonely cabin didn't feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a trap. And she and 7 children were caught right in the middle of it. The lie hung in the air between them for days. Evelyn saw Daniel every morning. He'd ride in from somewhere. She never knew where he went at night. He'd check the fence line or fix a loose shutter. His movements always quiet, his eyes always watching. He was a ghost haunting the edges of their new life. He would ask her if she needed anything. Flour? Salt? And she would look him straight in the eye, the word brother screaming in her mind, and she would simply say, "We're fine." She kept Caleb's journal hidden. It was her only secret, her only weapon. She read it every night, memorizing the details. Caleb wrote of his arguments with Daniel. Daniel had wanted to stay and fight Thacker head-on. Caleb, terrified for his children, had seen running as the only way. It was a classic story, the pragmatist versus the idealist, the father versus the uncle. But now the uncle was here, and the father was gone. And Evelyn was caught in the crossfire of their history. She didn't trust Daniel. How could she? But Caleb's letter had been clear. Don't let Thacker have the land. And she knew, with a sinking feeling, that she couldn't do it alone. The knock on the door came on a Tuesday. It wasn't a friendly knock. It was loud, official, and final. Evelyn opened the door to find a man with a silver star pinned to his vest. Sheriff Dow Rimple. He was a big man, with a face like a slab of granite and cold, unforgiving eyes. He wasn't alone. Standing just behind him, a smirk playing on his lips, was a man in a tailored suit that looked ridiculously out of place on the dusty prairie. He was holding a set of rolled-up papers. This had to be Thacker. "Ma'am," the sheriff said, not bothering to tip his hat. "This here is Mr. Thacker. He's filed a claim on this parcel of land. Says the previous owner, Caleb Avery, defaulted on a debt and signed the deed over to him." Thacker stepped forward, his smile widening. It was a predator's smile. "Just a formality, of course. The land is legally mine. I'm just here to inform you that you and the squatters have 3 weeks to vacate the premises." He gestured dismissively at the children, who were huddled behind Evelyn in the doorway. Evelyn's blood turned to ice. 3 weeks. It was a death sentence. Where would they go? What would they do? "This is their home," she said, her voice shaking but firm. Thacker chuckled. "This is my property, madam. And as for the children," he glanced at the sheriff, They aren't on any legal registry. No guardian, no next of kin. Once you're gone, the county will have to step in. They'll be taken to the orphanage in St. Joseph. Separated, most likely. It's a shame, really. The threat was clear. He wasn't just taking their home. He was going to destroy their family. Will stepped forward, his small body tense with rage. You can't do that. Thacker simply looked down at him with an expression of mild amusement before turning his gaze back to Evelyn. The law's the law. 3 weeks. The sheriff and Thacker turned and walked away, leaving Evelyn standing on the porch, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and fury. The children were crying now, the reality of the words orphanage and separated crashing down on them. She gathered them inside, her mind racing. She couldn't fight this. She had no papers, no money, no legal claim to anything. She was a stranger here. That night, as the children slept a fitful, uneasy sleep, she heard a soft footstep on the porch. It was Daniel. He was standing in the moonlight, his face grim. I saw them, he said. I saw Rimple and Thacker ride out. Evelyn's control finally snapped. And what did you do? She demanded, her voice a harsh whisper. Did you watch from the trees like you always do? Did you keep your distance while that man threatened to tear these children apart? Daniel had the grace to look ashamed. Evelyn, it's complicated. Complicated, she shot back, stepping toward him. He's going to send them to an orphanage. Is that complicated? Or is this part of your plan? Did you and Caleb cook this up together? Let the woman take the fall while you two settle your scores? No, of course not. Then why did you lie to me? She asked, her voice breaking. Why didn't you tell me you were his brother? Daniel flinched as if she had slapped him. The secret was out. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. I didn't, he started, then stopped. He looked out at the dark plains, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I didn't tell you because I was ashamed. Ashamed that I let my brother run. I told him we should fight, that Thacker was a snake, but he was just one man. Caleb wouldn't listen. He was so scared for the children, he couldn't think straight. He made me promise. Promise I wouldn't tell them he'd run away. He wanted them to think he was strong. He was strong, Evelyn said fiercely. He sacrificed himself to lead Thacker away from them. He gave up everything. Daniel looked at her, his eyes filled with a new respect. You believe that? I read his journal, she confessed. The second secret was out. I know about the spring. I know what Thacker really wants. And I know you wanted to fight him from the start. So let's fight him. A flicker of the old fire returned to Daniel's eyes. How? He has the law on his side. Rimple is in his pocket. He has a signed deed. I don't know, Evelyn admitted, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. But Caleb chose me to protect them. You're their uncle. Between the two of us, we have to find a way. We have 3 weeks. Daniel looked from her determined face to the dark windows of the cabin, where 7 children were dreaming of monsters. He finally nodded, a slow, resolute gesture. All right, Evelyn May Porter, he said, his voice low and steady. Let's fight. But their enemy was more cunning than they knew, and he wasn't just after the land anymore. He was after a secret buried beneath it, a secret Caleb had died to protect, and Thacker was willing to burn down the whole world to get it. The plan was desperate, a long shot stitched together with hope and fury. Evelyn and Daniel rode into the small, dusty town the next day. The town was called Providence, a name that felt like a cruel joke. They left Will in charge of the younger children, a heavy responsibility for a 12-year-old. But he accepted it with a solemn nod that made him look just like his father. Their first stop was the land office. Daniel strode in like he owned the place. Evelyn a half step behind him, clutching Caleb's journal to her chest. The clerk, a balding man with wire-rimmed glasses, looked up with an expression of pure boredom. We're here to contest the claim on the Avery homestead, Daniel announced, his voice echoing in the quiet room. The clerk sighed. That's been settled. Mr. Thacker holds the deed, signed and notarized. He tapped a thick ledger on his desk. Right here. The deed was signed under duress, Evelyn said, finding her voice. Caleb Avery was being threatened. Mr. Thacker coerced him. The clerk barely looked at her. Do you have proof of that, ma'am? Evelyn held up the journal. I have his own words. His journal. The clerk gave a short, humorless laugh. A diary? That's not a legal document. Unless you have a counter deed or a witness to this supposed coercion, there's nothing I can do. The land belongs to Mr. Thacker. It was a dead end. They walked out of the office into the harsh sunlight, the weight of their failure heavy on their shoulders. He controls everything, Evelyn, Daniel said, his jaw tight. The clerk, the sheriff. Thacker's had this town in his grip for years. There has to be someone he doesn't control, Evelyn insisted, her mind racing. She thought of the simple decency of the people on the trail, the small kindnesses exchanged between strangers. What about the people? The other homesteaders? They can't all be happy that one man is trying to control all the water. It was a new angle, an attack not through the law but through public opinion. They spent the rest of the day going from one small homestead to the next, a strange pair, the one-armed man and the determined spinster. They told their story. They told Caleb's story. They spoke of the 7 children who stood to lose everything. Some people shut the door in their faces, afraid of crossing a man as powerful as Thacker. But others listened. They saw the truth in Evelyn's eyes, the fierce protectiveness in Daniel's stance. They were farmers and ranchers who knew the value of water, and they understood the danger of one man having a monopoly on it. By the end of the day, they had 5 signatures on a roughly drawn petition. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Their last stop was the church. The pastor, a young man named Reverend Michael, listened to their story with a grave expression. He had seen the Avery children in town before. He knew of their quiet, resilient spirits. Mr. Thacker is a wealthy and influential member of my congregation, he said slowly, his fingers steepled. But the church is a house of God, not a house of commerce. What he is doing is morally wrong. I will speak to him, and I will add my name to your petition. They left the church with a renewed sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could turn the tide. But Thacker was always one step ahead. When they arrived back at the homestead, the scene that greeted them stole the breath from their lungs. The south pasture, the one that sat above the precious spring, was a sea of black smoke and orange flame. Thacker's men had set it on fire. The children were huddled on the porch, their faces streaked with soot and tears, watching in horror as the flames devoured the dry grass. Will ran to them, his face pale with terror. They just came. 3 of them. They said it was a warning from Mr. Thacker. Daniel let out a roar of pure rage and started for his horse, but Evelyn grabbed his arm. No, Daniel, that's what he wants. He wants you to ride in angry, to do something you can't take back. We can't fight him with fists. Then how do we fight him, Evelyn? He yelled, gesturing at the fire. He's burning down our home right in front of us. Evelyn looked at the fire, then at the terrified faces of the children, and then at the journal still clutched in her hand. Caleb had run. Daniel wanted to fight. Both had failed. She had to find a third way. Her eyes scanned the pages of the journal in her memory, searching for anything, any small detail she might have missed. Caleb had written about the spring, about Thacker's greed, but there was something else, a strange entry near the end. The old treaty line. The surveyors got it wrong in 48. The original map shows the line runs north of the creek, not south. If the old map is right, the spring isn't on my land at all. It's on the reservation. Her heart stopped. The reservation. The land that belonged to the local tribe. Land that was protected by federal treaty. Land that even a man like Thacker couldn't touch. It was the longest of long shots. The original survey maps were likely lost to time, if they ever existed at all, but it was the only hope they had left. Daniel, she said, her voice low and urgent, we're not going to fight Thacker for the land. He looked at her, confused. What are you talking about? We're going to prove, she said, a wild, audacious plan forming in her mind, that the land was never his to take in the first place. The fire in the pasture was a warning, but Thacker had underestimated them. He thought he was fighting a grieving spinster and a broken farmer. He didn't realize he was fighting a mother protecting her young, and that was a battle he was never going to win. But finding a decades-old map was one thing. Convincing the world to believe it was another. And time was running out. They had less than 2 weeks before Thacker would arrive to claim the children. The search felt impossible. They were looking for a ghost, a single piece of paper from nearly 30 years ago that could rewrite the history of the entire county. Daniel remembered hearing stories from old-timers about the original survey. Most of them were dead now, but one was still alive. An old man named Silas Croft, who lived as a hermit in the hills miles from town. He was their only lead. Leaving the children in the care of the pastor's wife, a kind woman who brought them into the safety of the rectory, Evelyn and Daniel rode out at dawn. The air was still thick with the smell of smoke from their burned pasture, a constant, bitter reminder of what was at stake. They found Silas Croft's cabin tucked into a rocky canyon. He was ancient, with a long white beard and eyes that had seen too much. He was suspicious at first, barely willing to speak to them, but when Daniel mentioned the Avery name, the old man's expression softened. Caleb's father, Elias Avery, knew him, Silas rasped. Good man. Stood up to Thacker's father back in the day, too. That family's been poisoned in this valley for generations. Evelyn explained their situation, telling him about the journal and Caleb's theory about the original treaty line. Silas nodded slowly, stroking his beard. The boy was right. I was on that original survey team. Just a kid hauling chains. The line was supposed to follow the ridge north of the creek, but Thacker's father had the territorial governor in his pocket. When the official maps were drawn up, the line had moved. Funny how that happens when there's good water involved. Hope surged in Evelyn's chest. The map, Silas. The original survey map. Do you know where it is? The old man's face fell. It was filed with the Territorial Records Office. But years ago there was a fire. A very convenient fire. All those old records went up in smoke. Thacker's father made sure of it. It was another dead end. The proof they needed was gone, turned to ash. The despair was so thick Evelyn could taste it. They rode back toward town in silence, the weight of their defeat pressing down on them. They had a witness, but a crazy old hermit's word meant nothing against Thacker's power and a notarized deed. As they passed the burned-out edge of the homestead, Daniel suddenly pulled his horse to a stop. He was staring at the old stone chimney, the only thing still standing from the original cabin that had been on the property before Caleb built the new one. What is it? Evelyn asked. My father, Daniel said slowly, his eyes distant. He never trusted banks. He never trusted paper. He used to say, the only thing that lasts is stone. He slid off his horse and walked toward the old chimney, his footsteps slow, deliberate. Evelyn followed, her heart starting to beat a little faster. Daniel ran his hand over the rough-hewn stones of the hearth. He stopped at one near the bottom. It was slightly different from the others, the mortar around it newer. He pulled a knife from his belt and began to patiently chip away at the mortar. After a few minutes, the stone loosened. He pulled it free, revealing a dark, hollow space inside. Reaching in, his fingers closed around a metal box, rusted and heavy. He carried it back into the yard and pried it open. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed cloth, was a rolled-up canvas map. It was the original survey map, signed by the territorial surveyor in 1848. A thick, clear line marked the boundary. And just as Caleb had suspected, it ran along the ridge, north of the creek. The spring, the precious lifeblood of the valley, was not on their land. It was on protected tribal land. Thacker had no claim to it. He never did. They stared at the map, a wave of triumphant relief washing over them. They had it. The proof. The weapon that could finally bring Thacker down. But as Evelyn looked closer, she saw something else tucked into the corner of the box. A small folded piece of paper. It was a letter. The handwriting was faint, written by a woman's hand. It was from Caleb and Daniel's mother, and it was addressed to her husband, Elias. My dearest Elias, if you are reading this, it means the worst has happened. Thacker knows about the gold. He thinks it's on our land, near the spring. I fear what he will do to get it. You must protect the boys. You must protect the map. It is the only thing that proves our claim is just. But hide this letter. Let no one know the real reason the Thackers want our home. Their greed is not for water, but for what lies beneath it. Gold. It was never about the water. The water was just a cover story. There was gold on the land, and the Thackers had been trying to get their hands on it for 2 generations. Suddenly, everything made a terrifying kind of sense. The threats, the fire, Thacker's relentless obsession. This wasn't business. It was a blood feud. And Caleb hadn't just been running from a debt. He'd been running to protect a secret that could get his entire family killed. Daniel looked up from the letter, his face pale. "My God," he whispered. "All these years, I thought my father was just stubborn about a patch of dirt. I never knew." The stakes had just been raised impossibly high. They weren't just fighting for a home anymore. They were fighting for their lives, and now they knew something that Thacker would kill to keep secret. Their victory felt hollow, replaced by a cold, creeping fear. Holding the map felt like holding a lit stick of dynamite. The next day, a new rider appeared on the horizon. This one wasn't a sheriff or a land baron. He was tall and lean, dressed in expensive clothes from back east. He rode right up to the cabin as if he owned it, a cold arrogance in his eyes. "I'm looking for the Avery children," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. "My name is Franklin Hayes. I am Caleb Avery's cousin and the executor of his estate." He held up a sheaf of papers, stamped with official-looking seals from Boston. "I've come to take the children home, where they belong." This was a new nightmare, a new unexpected attack, this one cloaked in legitimacy and concern. Thacker hadn't been able to remove the children with force, so he had found another way. He had found a distant relative, a man with a legal claim that could override everything. Evelyn stared at the man, at his clean boots and his cold smile, and she knew. This wasn't a cousin. This was a pawn, another one of Thacker's pieces in a deadly game, and he had just made a move that could put them all in checkmate. The man who called himself Franklin Hayes was a snake in a silk vest. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make threats. He just smiled his cold, empty smile and presented his papers. There was a will apparently signed by Caleb years ago, naming him as guardian in the event of his death. There were court orders from a judge back in Boston. It all looked impeccably legal. "The children will be given the finest education," Hayes said, his eyes sweeping over the humble cabin with disdain. "They will live in comfort. It's what Caleb would have wanted." Daniel stepped forward, his one hand clenched into a fist. Caleb wanted them here, on this land, with their family. Hayes raised an eyebrow. "And who are you, sir?" "I'm their uncle," Daniel said, his voice a low growl. "Ah, yes, the estranged brother," Hayes said, his smile tightening. "The one Caleb didn't see fit to name as guardian. I wonder why that is." He turned his attention back to Evelyn. "And you, madam, you are who, exactly? A mail-order bride who never was? You have no legal standing here whatsoever. You are, to put it plainly, a trespasser." Every word was a carefully aimed dart, designed to undermine their confidence, to make them feel powerless, and it was working. What did they have? A secret map and a dead woman's letter. He had court orders. "You're not taking them," Evelyn said, her voice quiet but unyielding. She positioned herself in front of the cabin door, a silent barrier between this man and the children inside. Hayes's smile finally faded. "I have the law on my side. Sheriff Rimple will be here within the hour to escort the children. You can either make this easy, or you can make this difficult. The choice is yours, but the outcome will be the same." He turned and walked back to his horse, leaving them with his ultimatum. The clock was ticking. Panic began to set in. They were trapped. If they showed Thacker the map, he would know they knew about the gold, and he would stop at nothing to silence them permanently. If they didn't, this man, Hayes, would take the children, and Thacker would get the land anyway. They were out of moves. It was Will, the quiet, watchful oldest boy, who gave them their only hope. He had been listening from inside the cabin. He came out onto the porch, his face set with a determination far beyond his years. In his hand, he held the small wooden box where Evelyn had kept the children's unsent letters to their father. "He's not our cousin," Will said, his voice clear and strong. Evelyn looked at him. "How do you know, honey?" "Pa told me about our family back east. He said we didn't have any. Not anymore. He said his only family was his brother." He looked at Daniel. "And us." It was a child's memory against a stack of legal documents. But it was enough. It was the crack in Hayes' story they needed. "He's a fraud, Daniel," Evelyn whispered. "Thacker must have hired him. The will, the court orders, they have to be forgeries." "But how do we prove it?" Daniel asked, the frustration evident in his voice. "It's his word against a 12-year-old's. Evelyn's eyes fell to the box in Will's hands. The letters, the children's pain, written in their own hands. It wasn't legal proof, but it was powerful. It was human. A new plan, more dangerous than any before it, began to form in her mind. They couldn't win in a courtroom. They couldn't win with a fight. So they would have to win in the court of public opinion. They were going to tell the whole story. When Sheriff Rimple arrived with 2 deputies, ready to forcibly remove the children, he found a silent crowd waiting for him. The pastor was there. So was his wife. And behind them stood the farmers and ranchers Evelyn and Daniel had spoken to, the ones who had signed their petition. They stood with their arms crossed, their faces grim, blocking the path to the cabin. Reverend Michael stepped forward. "Sheriff, there seems to be some confusion. These children have a home." Rimple's face flushed with anger. "This is a legal matter, Reverend. I have a court order." "And we have a community," the pastor replied calmly, "a community that looks after its own." Just then, Evelyn and Daniel rode up, but not from the cabin. They came from the direction of the town, and they weren't alone. Beside them rode Silas Croft, the old surveyor, looking frail but resolute, and with them was Miss Abby, the town's schoolteacher. Thacker and Hayes, who had been watching from a distance, looked on in confusion. This was not how they had planned it. Evelyn dismounted and walked to the center of the standoff. She wasn't holding a map or a journal. She was holding the children's letters. "These children are not orphans and they are not squatters," she said, her voice ringing out in the tense silence. "They are a family that has been terrorized and threatened by a greedy man who wants to steal their land." She looked directly at Thacker. "You told them their father abandoned them. You told them they weren't worth loving. But you're the one who is worthless, Mr. Thacker. You're the one who isn't worthy of this land, this community." Then she began to read the letters aloud. She read Will's letter about his brother's bloody feet. She read Maggie's letter about Daisy forgetting her father's face. She read Samuel's heartbreaking question. Her voice cracked with emotion, but she never stopped. With every word, the faces of the townspeople hardened. They looked from the tear-streaked faces of the children on the porch to the furious, cornered expression on Thacker's face. When she finished, a heavy silence fell over the yard. The only sound was the wind. Then Miss Abby, the school teacher, stepped forward. She was holding a piece of paper. "This man," she said, pointing a trembling finger at Franklin Hayes, "is not Caleb Avery's cousin. The real Franklin Hayes was a student of mine years ago, back in Pennsylvania. He died of consumption in the spring of '58. I attended his funeral." She held up the paper. It was a faded funeral notice from an old newspaper. The lie was exposed. Hayes's face went white. He was a fraud, an imposter. Thacker saw the tide turn. He saw the anger in the eyes of his neighbors. His careful plan was collapsing around him. In a final desperate act of rage, he pulled a pistol from his coat. "This land is mine!" he screamed, his voice wild with fury. He aimed the pistol not at Daniel, not at Evelyn, but at Will. Before anyone could react, Daniel moved. He launched himself at Thacker, a blur of motion. He wasn't a farmer anymore. He was a warrior, protecting his family. The 2 men crashed to the ground. The gun went off, the shot echoing across the plains. The crowd gasped. For a moment, no one moved. Then Daniel stood up, breathing heavily. Thacker lay on the ground, clutching his leg, a dark stain spreading across his trousers. He had shot himself in the struggle. It was over. The sheriff, seeing which way the wind was blowing, quickly arrested the whimpering Thacker and the terrified imposter, Hayes. The townspeople surged forward, surrounding Evelyn and the children, their faces filled with support and relief. Later that evening, after the chaos had subsided, Daniel finally showed the map to the pastor and a few of the town elders. The secret of the gold remained hidden, but the truth about the land was revealed. Thacker's claim was built on a lie, generations old. The homestead was safe. The family was safe. Weeks turned into months. The burned pasture began to show new shoots of green. The cabin, once a place of sorrow and fear, was now filled with laughter. Daniel moved in, officially becoming the uncle the children had never known they had. He and Evelyn worked side by side, rebuilding the fences, planting a garden, creating a home. They weren't a conventional family, but they were real. One day a letter arrived. It was from a lawyer in Boston. It seemed a distant, wealthy relative of Caleb's had heard their story. He was impressed by Evelyn's courage and moved by the children's plight. He made her an offer. He would sell the grand family home in Boston and give her the money. Enough money to start over, to give the children anything they could ever want, to leave the harshness of the prairie behind forever. It was a generous offer, a ticket to an easier life. That evening, Evelyn sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky. The children were playing in the yard, their voices carrying on the evening air. Daniel came and sat beside her, handing her a mug of coffee. He didn't say anything. He just sat with her, a comfortable silence settling between them. She looked at the letter, then at the life they had built. A life of hardship, yes, but also of profound joy. A life forged in fire and fear, but tempered with love and loyalty. She looked at Daniel, at the quiet strength in his eyes. She looked at Will, teaching Samuel how to skip stones. She looked at Daisy, asleep on a blanket, her one-eyed doll clutched to her chest. Caleb had sent for her, hoping she could be a mother to his children, but he had given her so much more. He had given her a purpose. He had given her a family. He had given her a home. She smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She knew her answer. She was already living the better life. Evelyn May Porter was a woman the world had tried to write off, but in a lonely cabin in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by 7 children who weren't hers, and a man who was bound to her by tragedy and hope, she had rewritten her own story. She had chosen to stay. She had chosen to fight. She had chosen to love. And that's the thing about family. It isn't always about who you're born to. Sometimes it's about who shows up, who stands beside you when the world tries to tear you down, and who chooses to call your heart their home. If Evelyn's story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of found families and second chances, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We tell stories here about forgotten heroes and the quiet courage it takes to build a life. And let me know in the comments below. What would you have done with the offer from Boston? Would you have taken the money or would you have stayed? Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next story.